It was a crisis that reached into the very centre of British politics and led to the resignation of the country's most senior policeman. Hello and welcome to A Simple Question with me, Phil Rees. The revelation that journalists hacked into the voicemail messages of the victims of crime led to the closure of Britain's most popular newspaper, the News of the World, and also to the arrest of many of its former staff. But even more significantly, the firestorm surrounding the scandal led to serious questions about the integrity of Britain's ruling elite. Well, before we ask the people of London what they think, here's a quick video clip.
The turning point came when it emerged that a reporter from the News of the World had hacked into the voicemail of a murdered teenager, Millie Dowler. The hacking of Millie's phone after she went missing gave her parents false hopes that the 13-year-old schoolgirl was still alive. The revelations came 6 years after it was first uncovered that an employee of the News of the World had intercepted the phone messages of Britain's royal family. The first phone hacking scandal appeared to be limited to one rogue reporter, with the conviction in 2007 of the News of the World's royal editor, Clive Goodman, and the private investigator Glenn Mulcair. The then editor, Andy Coulson, resigned, but claimed he knew nothing of the phone hacking. Shortly afterwards, Andy Coulson became David Cameron's communications director. As evidence grew that the phone hacking scandal was much wider than one rogue reporter, Coulson resigned from his job as Downing Street's communications director in January 2011.
The important thing to remember is that Andy Coulson doesn't work for the government anymore, and of course when he was working for the government no one made any complaints about the work that he did. But let's let the police and the other investigations get on with their job.
In July, he was arrested in connection with allegations of corruption and phone hacking. The spotlight then fell on links between News International, the parent company that owns the News of the World and the Sun, and members of Britain's police force. Sir Paul Stevenson, the Commissioner of London's Metropolitan Police, which is heading the investigation into the phone hacking scandal, announced his resignation in July 2011. It emerged that he'd hired a former deputy editor of the News of the World as a public relations consultant for the police, at the same time that the force was conducting an investigation into the phone hacking allegations. Questions about the relationship between the police and the newspaper group were further raised when it emerged that nearly 1/4 of the Metropolitan Police's press staff have worked for News International at some point. Meanwhile, the chief executive of News Corporation, James Murdoch, appeared alongside his father, Rupert, the founder of the media empire, before a parliamentary select committee investigating phone hacking. Rupert Murdoch said he cannot be held responsible for the events at the News of the World, claiming he was let down by people he trusted. The News Corporation boss said he was not aware of the extent of phone hacking there, and had clearly been misled by some of his staff. His son James apologised to victims, saying hacking was inexcusable. Despite appearing to know nothing of what went on in the newspapers they ran, James and Rupert Murdoch and the former head of News International, Rebecca Brooks, will continue to be under scrutiny from a series of independent inquiries and police investigations in the coming months and years. There have also been widespread calls for a reform of the Press Complaints Commission, the self-regulatory body that oversees newspapers. And the revelations of malpractice have had even wider resonance, raising questions about the role of journalism in Britain, as well as standards in public life.
A Simple Question is a show that finds out what the public is thinking here on the streets of London. Well, I started today by finding out what they knew about the phone hacking scandal and who they thought was responsible.
Well, in terms of what's happened, they basically hack people's phones, don't they? It doesn't matter whether they're a celebrity or not. It's an invasion of personal privacy, isn't it? So, that's a major thing sort of for everybody, because in terms of us watching the media and the newspapers and everything, it's sort of where does it stop? You're going to politicians, celebrities, then politicians. What about the general public, The whole thing with Millie Dowler, Dowler? Yeah. That was a massive infringement on personal rights and privacy and things like that. So, in terms of what I know what I read in the paper, but in terms of how I feel about it, I think it's pretty bad.
Well, according to what I've read and heard, they did tap various people's phones and listen in on the conversations. Rupert Murdoch and his crew were involved, and also apparently the Metropolitan Police have been involved.
So what do you know about the phone hacking scandal, and who do you think was responsible for it?
I believe that, from what I know, News of the World were the ones responsible for it. And even though there's been a couple of journalists that have been pinpointed for personally being responsible for it, it probably goes to the very top, and it's Rupert Murdoch and some of the influential management who are really responsible for it.
Every journalist is looking for a scoop, and it's probably a case of overzealousness on the part of some journalists. They've gone too far under sometimes stress of amazing proportions, and they want to get there first. So I can understand this to some extent.
Yeah, what I know is that the journalists hacked into people's phones to I don't know, check their messages and see what they've been up to. I know that it blew up for them when they've been doing it for a while. It got them into trouble because they hacked into some kid who went missing's phone, and that caused the scandal to erupt. I know that they've been in front of the House of Commons a couple of times, the Murdochs and the various senior people.
The majority of newspapers unequivocally have been doing the same thing. Unless you say innocent until proven guilty, but I have no doubt that some of them, pretty much all of them, would have been using that. Just depends how much and to what degree. But I mean, it's as much the same as, the differing interviewing techniques they've had. How far are they going to push that? I'm sure they've all done it. Even the most outwardly respectable newspapers, I have no doubt. Whether they've done it once or 1,000 times, and they've done it to a nobody or the Queen, that's a different matter.
I heard that it was Murdoch who obviously oversaw all of it, but obviously it's quite unclear who was responsible behind it, and I think that's probably the main problem, that no one's quite clearly to blame, and someone from above obviously might have given that order, but no one can really distinguish right now who decided to do it, and therefore who should be blamed for how wrong it was.
Well, those were the views of the people on the streets of London. Now, let's hear from the experts who study politics and media.
Yes, I'm sure that Rupert Murdoch knew what was going on. In a vague sort of way. I very much doubt whether he had very much detail about it, and maybe also, if you're a man in his position, you take trouble not to investigate. You want to know in a general way. And I think one of the curious things about this whole episode is that the senior editors who said they were worried about what was going on, they just handed it over to their local lawyers to investigate. There was no concerted effort to actually discover what was going on. And I mean, obviously the phone hacking itself went on at a sort of medium level or quite a low level, the people who are actually sort of doing the activity itself. But what seems very surprising in retrospect is that senior editors who must have known since they were paying the bills, they must have known in a vague sort of way what was going on, that they didn't take a closer interest, and you would have expected it on any other newspaper. I think you would have expected the senior editors to take a closer interest in what was going on.
Well, I think responsibility for this spreads widely, and I think one of the very good outcomes so far is that there'll be a wide-ranging public inquiry, which will look at the causes as well as what happened. And I think you can certainly say that the journalists completely lost their way. Ethically, I mean, this is illegal, but ethically and morally, it's appalling to think that, for example, the infamous case of Millie Dowler, they hacked the phone of a missing teenager, a schoolgirl, who was actually at the time dead. She'd been murdered. And they actually deleted voicemails. So her mother, when her mother was persistently ringing her, and she got through to the voicemail, and she said she must have deleted a voicemail. She thought her daughter was alive at that moment. Absolutely astonishingly immoral. So journalists lost their way completely. The people responsible for those journalists clearly bear responsibility for that, and some of them have had to resign. That's to say editors and senior executives in News of the World and the parent company News International. They bear responsibility because it's their company, it's their culture, they're selling these newspapers. And if they didn't know about it, they should have. And if they knew about it, they should have stopped it and told the police. So they bear responsibility too. And that goes right up to Rupert Murdoch.
So, was the Prime Minister right to appoint Andy Coulson as his communications director? And has the close relationship between members of the Metropolitan Police and News International damaged the reputation of the police force in Britain? Let's find out. Now, this scandal has reached the very centre of British politics in the sense of Andy Coulson resigned as Director of Communications. Do you think David Cameron, the Prime Minister, made a mistake in hiring him?
Absolutely. I think he made a big mistake. And again, he hasn't really been questioned for it. I think everyone's let him get away with it, you know? Why did he hire him, especially someone with a track record like his, which is extremely questionable. But I think that for years now, the politicians have been linked very closely to the media, and especially to the reactionary media, and they've got a lot of them in their pockets. And for me, it's a very murky world, you know? Politicians and media, it goes hand in hand, and they, you know, I scrub your back, you scrub my back, and there's a lot of questions that remained unsolved. And for me, the saddest thing is that every single one of them probably going to get away with it.
Yeah, in hindsight, definitely. But I mean, you know, with all of those people, really being harsh, if you use the same sort of rules, you probably wouldn't employ half the people. It's a difficult thing. You know, I mean, how many people are really whiter than white? But that's been British politics. Someone's caught with their trousers down for some offence, whatever it is, and they're forced to resign, and then they come back, not just Mandelson and other people, they come back later. So it's a difficult thing in those, you know, in city firms, in the legal profession, in the media, all those things. Really, how many people have, to be honest, a blameless, not conspiracy theories, but how many have a blameless track record? I think, you know, majority, minority is not difficult to say, but you certainly wouldn't be employing half the people, to be quite frank about it.
What do you think about Andy Coulson, the former editor of the News of the World, who went on to work for the Prime Minister? Do you think it was an error of judgment to appoint him?
I think that the Prime Minister himself afterwards probably thought that he shouldn't have employed him. I think it might have been, yes. He may have done the wrong thing there, and I think he was aware, I think he himself realised, the Prime Minister realised that he had maybe slipped up there. He shouldn't have employed him.
David Cameron made an error of judgment in hiring the former News of the World editor Andy Coulson, when, of course, we already knew that phone hacking had been taking place under his watch.
Yes, but I can sympathise with Cameron at the same time, giving the person a second chance. I do believe Cameron knew at the time that phone hacking was going on under Andy Coulson's watch. I'm not too sure whether he believed that the victims of, say, the 7/7 attacks or the relatives of Millie Dowler, that I'm not too sure about.
I think it's quite a bad reflection on the government that he's working for the government, but he was involved in this. If they're going to trust people to run our government that are involved in this sort of thing, they could be doing other things that are similar to the phone hacking. And who knows that it's not going on within the government for the government's own purposes as well, if they're going to treat people like that.
Well, one person who didn't get away with it was the head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Paul Stevenson. Again, he had very close links with members of News International. Do you think the image of the police has been tarnished in all of this?
Yeah, I think it has been. I mean, for me, this should be definitely it's a police issue, and they should be maybe chastised for not going down hard on the politicians and also on the media. But again, if you've got some influential politicians and the people from the media and people from the police, and then they've got a lot of influence. So the way that I see it, they're just covering each other, and they're, you know, letting them get away with murder, really. It's just a shame that, as usual, it's just the average working man, apart from, I mean, up to a certain extent, he's been made the scapegoat. But it goes much higher than him, than the Chief Officer of the Metropolitan Police. I think it goes a lot higher than that, and people with a lot of influence have been involved in this.
The police get a hard rap, don't they? They've got a hard job to do. You know, obviously something needs to be done, and there's a lot of people that are involved. So, you know, I wouldn't beat the police up. I think that I think they actually do the best that they can do. Whether they're being pushed from pillar to post by politicians getting involved, or whether it's something internal, something's certainly got to be done about people evading other people's privacy, hasn't it?
I think police need credibility, and it's damaged their credibility.
The head of the Metropolitan Police resigned. Do you think that the police service in Britain has been tarnished by their close relations to staff from News International?
I think so, yes. I think so. You know, we have to put trust in the police, etc. And when this sort of, how can you say it, backhand dealing goes on, it's not right. But you see, the thing is with Rupert Murdoch in general, he's the goose that lays the golden egg. Alistair Campbell was a political editor many moons ago for the Daily Mirror, and they were totally against Sky. They were the Sun, News International, et al. And they were always banging Murdoch to rights, etc. But him, Mandelson and Tony Blair, they went out there, they jetted out to his conference, managed to coerce him and get their backing for the Labour Party to win 3 elections in a row. So people use Murdoch when it suits their convenience.
So no, I don't think that the reputation of the Metropolitan Police has been tarnished, but I do think that a lot of people are not happy with the way that the size of the police force is supposedly going to be reduced because they don't have enough money to fund the police force at the current size. And they were originally talking about laying off support staff, but there are talks of laying off full police officers also.
Different views there from the public. So do our experts think that Britain's Prime Minister has been damaged by the scandal? And what about the image of the police force?
He hired Andy Coulson, who was the former editor of the News of the World, because I think he thought that it would be very useful to have somebody with this very close interest and knowledge of the Murdoch empire. I mean, I think one has to see all this in the context of the immense power that the Murdoch empire operates within the British political system. It has done for at least 20 years, certainly since the period of Tony Blair and the Labour government in the 1990s. The police angle is one of the more intriguing stories to have emerged from the whole affair. Again, we've always known about sort of a corrupt policeman, but nobody has ever this has never happened before on quite this scale, that the media should be so involved with the Metropolitan Police. I mean, we've seen, you know, the collapse of 2 senior police commissioners running the Metropolitan Police. I mean, this is unheard of. This is a real crisis at the heart of the British state.
Well, it proves, in retrospect, that David Cameron was definitely not right to hire him. That's not to say I'm convicting Andy Coulson of having knowledge of phone hacking when it was going on. But, I mean, the man is clearly tainted with the whole affair, and badly tainted, and he has now to struggle to clear his name. Now, that's a lot deeper into the problem than clearly David Cameron realised or was prepared to acknowledge when he appointed him first as opposition media manager when the Tories were in opposition, and then took him to Downing Street to be one of the 4 or 5 people closest to the Prime Minister in this country. The level of self-doubt, criticism, scepticism that a Prime Minister needs to exercise in these things is very high. You have to be careful, and it looks very bad. It looks like a very foolish misjudgment. But we need to know why this case was not fully investigated back in 2006 and 2007 when it first broke. So what happened back then was that the private investigator and 1 reporter were jailed. How much evidence was there then that other reporters were involved? As far as we can make out, there was quite a bit. So if there was quite a bit of evidence of that, of a more widespread criminal problem, why did the police not investigate it? And one of the big questions to be answered in the long term is, how afraid were they? How afraid were politicians of this big, powerful media organisation, or of the media generally? Was it fear, or was it indeed something worse? Is there an element of corruption here? So we need the questions answered.
The phone hacking scandal follows a series of revelations of corruption and greed involving members of parliament and bankers. So has the crisis, in a broad sense, exposed the relationship between big business and public service in Britain? And in a more particular way, has it revealed Rupert Murdoch's power over successive British governments?
Of course, we've always known that. He backed Margaret Thatcher in 83 and 87, and following on from that, John Major in 92, and then 3 general election victories for Tony Blair. And I'll tell you something, Gordon Brown made a fantastic speech. His last as party leader at the Labour Party conference in 2009, it was a fantastic speech. And then that night, following morning, Conservatives said they were backing Cameron, and that really just screwed everything up for him. So it just shows you the power Rupert Murdoch and his media empire has on this nation, especially big political parties.
The only reason that Tony Blair got into power was because of Rupert Murdoch, and because the Sun switched from supporting the Conservative government to supporting Labour. And I'm not sure who the person's name was, but I know that an insider said that. Actually, it was Ken Livingstone. I heard Ken Livingstone on LBC a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that Rupert Murdoch called Tony Blair from his yacht in Australia, and Tony Blair had to leave everything and go running over to Rupert Murdoch. He's an extremely powerful person, not just in this country, but also abroad in Australia, in the US, controlling Fox News. And for me, Rupert Murdoch's directly responsible for not just for this, but also for being one of the main drum beaters for the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, now supporting the war in Libya.
Someone like Murdoch, his business interests are so widespread, so varied, that you take the Sunday Times, would he really want on the front page things, recession, depression, etc.? You think how much that would knock his stock value. There are so many things about Tesco that won't ever appear in the Sunday Times. Why? Because they advertise with them. So certain stories about companies, institutions like that. So that's why. So again, to go back to sort of someone like Private Eye, because they will ridicule Labour and Conservative and Liberal alike, whereas a lot of other papers will definitely take a stance in one direction or other. So not just politics, but for business. And Murdoch has been business influenced. I think that no question that influences a lot of the stuff that's gone on the front page of the Sunday Times, etc., over the last 10 years, easily.
I think in the British government, everyone, if they've got money, they can kind of influence the government as much as they want, and especially with Murdoch, he owns like most of the news companies in England, and that's how things are spread through the country. So I think it's quite a big influence in the government, and I think that needs to be changed, really.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week. Thank you for joining us. If you want to have your say, send an email to asimplequestion@presstv.com. That's asimplequestion@presstv.com. Meanwhile, I'll see you next week.